Mark, do you have a marching order you'd like to go in? Would you like me to go first? Would you like
Yeah,
to go
please.
first?
And let me just say first, Patricia and Stephanie, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And Charles,
Absolutely.
by
Let
all
me
means.
second that as well. I'm always happy to have the opportunity to read at Malaprops. I guess Mark and I have both had the chance to read there a number of times, going back, I guess, over a decade now. So this is certainly another way to visit with some of my friends in Asheville as well.
Charles, may I
Yeah.
add that I met Charles's wife at a Malaprops reading. I was reading there many years ago. You recall
Oh, wow.
this?
Yeah, that was a
20
while ago.
2012.
20, yeah,
Is that
yeah,
possible?
probably.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that would have made sense.
So always good things.
Yeah, Asheville's changed a lot in those times, I'm sure, last 10 years. But yeah, again. Um, so I guess I'm going to read a little bit and then throw it to Mark, and maybe if he has a question, and then he'll read, and then I can ask him a question, and then we'll see where that puts us on time. And of course, as Patricia mentioned, you can ask any questions as we move along. Which I mean, I know that I'm probably speaking for both of us when I say that I find these readings to be a lot more fruitful and interesting when the audience chips in with that, whatever kind of curiosities that you might have, because Mark and I both spend time in the classroom, and having that back and forth is it brings a dynamic that's different than just the two of us sitting here talking, and we can do that as well. So my book is called A Year Without Months. Both of these books are new from West Virginia University Press. I have Lioness here as well. And this is a book that it is a collection of essays, but I've also, when describing the book, have called it a fragmented memoir, because I think that it suits the book well. It deals with a great many difficult issues. An exploration of mental illness, of suicide, of the natural world and the consolations of the natural world, and seeing how those all stitch together, particularly in my own experience as a grieving parent. So that's the general conceit or the design of the book. But what I'm going to read from tonight is one of the essays that I think is particularly appropriate given the events of the last 24 hours. And it's one that was published in the Bitter Southerner. It's called an essay called "Why I Don't Hunt Anymore," which is a bit of a misnomer, and you'll see what I mean when I get into the essay itself. But I am going to read it in its entirety because it is fairly short. It was published there, I think, in 2020, I think, or maybe 2019, I can't remember now. And it is a bit different than the rest of the essays in the collection, in that it's a bit more combative. It's a bit more of a polemic, I guess you would call it, than the other pieces that are a little bit more of self exploration in the vein of a writer like Montaigne or Seneca or someone like that. So I'll read that and then turn it over to Mark at that point. When I hunted the southern woods as a boy, my first concern had little to do with what I might kill. Instead, I time traveled. At home during the week, I consumed repeated viewings of Grizzly Adams, Daniel Boone, and Jeremiah Johnson. But when the weekends came around, a century dropped out from underneath me. My life became the ritual concerns of making camp, reading sign, collecting kindling. The campfire was by far my favorite TV program, and I could stare for hours into its suspense and drama. The most important lesson from the camp was what I could learn from the trails and creek beds and swamp bottoms, and how they provided a sufficiency that would be hard to express to anyone who had never experienced it for themselves. Today, though, I feel no desire to pick up a rifle or shotgun and walk the Tennessee ridges and hollers within the easy driving distance of my home. It's been close to 20 years since I've sat in a deer blind or called for a tom turkey at daybreak. This doesn't come from a place of anti-hunting. I have believed, and still do, that there should be a psychological price exacted by eating animals. If you're willing to eat meat, you should be willing to kill to do so. If we have learned anything in the last 3 decades about food ethics, it's that most Americans rely on a largely brutal, though an impressively expedient system to deliver the lion's share of our protein needs. So I maintain a large respect for those who go out to their tree stands to fill their freezers with wild meat. I think they don't let squeamishness cancel out their natural appetites. If more people did so, we would have a healthier ecology and an infinitely more well-adjusted relationship to what we put in our bellies. I still enjoy my time in the woods. I continue to camp, paddle, hike, and fish throughout the year. And yes, I even cook ribeye steak over the campfires when I go on these trips. I'm even more avid in these pursuits than when I was a boy. My love of nature has deepened, which I think is a common effect of growing older. My desire to experience wilderness on its own terms has entwined with my love for reading about it. Instead of the old Hollywood versions of outdoor adventure that fired my imagination as a boy, I revisit my Thoreau, Emerson, and Abbey, where I dig deeper into my more recent encounters with John McPhee and Sigurd Olson. I've tried to grow in my understanding, become more open to its contemplative parts. Still, this evolution wouldn't be enough to dispel my nostalgic ties to those hunting camps with their many meaningful tales and legends. Too much personal accomplishment is back there behind me to want to give it up. I have realized then that my change of attitude isn't in the southern woods or my own development, but in a large percentage of the southern outdoorsman himself. I use the word outdoorsman with intentional precision because the change, though not universal, has largely been male. While there are those who still practice the reverence and respect that were hallmarks of my youthful hunting experience, it seems their numbers thin each season. Instead of the ethic of leave no trace, there is another kind of code. On the interstate, you see it on the back panels and rear windows of tricked out pickup trucks, stylized decals with phrases like bone collector, or pictures of deer skulls against American flags, the graphic logo of the American flags with the graphic logo of the comic book vigilante, the Punisher. The pastoral somehow got swapped out with the paramilitary while I wasn't paying attention, and I can't think of anything worse that could have happened to the average hunter. It's hard to understand anything in the rural South today without viewing it through the lens of reactionary politics and what's supposed to pass for conservative culture. Southern white manhood doesn't know what to do with itself. People outside and inside the region consistently ridicule it for its role in racial prejudice, sexist dogma, and overall violent propensities. Some have paid attention to these criticisms, tried to be more thoughtful about how they move through the world while holding on to the traditions that still hold real value to them. But so many others have listened to their baser impulses, lashed out, doubled down. They've committed themselves to this burlesque of masculinity that has become a new standard of the Southern man out in the woods. They've forgotten what it means to experience the beauty of the wilderness. They don't go out there to embrace solitude and time. They go out there to pull a trigger, and they have no qualms about advertising the fact. This desire to show off, to practice vain machismo, it changes everything. The act of hunting becomes mere background to the desire to offend. It is a cultural theater, and it measures its effectiveness in terms of its ability to provoke an emotional response, not understanding. It paints blood everywhere it can, often in an Instagram or Twitter feed. I'm keenly aware of the financial contribution and conservation that comes from hunters' license fees. This is what makes the statistics released by the Department of Interior in 2017 showing a decline in hunting so alarming. I believe a significant factor in this change is that the kind of hunter I write about has largely gone unchecked by the greater hunting community. The problem with rot is that it can be contagious. If left alone, either from avoidance or indifference, infection affects a larger body. The crisis we face as people who care about the outdoors and hunting traditions is a crisis of messaging. It's naive to believe that iconography doesn't matter, even when these images come from the fringes. Fear of scrutiny is cowardice. Ignorance of the power of the symbol is foolish. We have a problem, and it is up to the average decent hunter to say something about it. Recently, I canoed for a week with a small group of close friends in the Quetico Superior region that comprises the border between Canada and upper Minnesota. Each of us was born and raised in some part of the South, and it was our first time in the fabled lake country. We have made many trips together throughout the southern woods, paddling, hiking, drinking, and telling amiable lies. We're all writers and care about the woods. We know one another, what we're about. By the end of the trip, we had noticed something different about the North Country, not in the woods themselves, which were as stark and as striking as we expected them to be, but in the small town of Ely and its immediate surroundings. It's a place that couldn't be denser with sportsmen, not just canoe paddlers and kayakers, but walleye fishermen and big game hunters too. Most of them big blue collar men who weren't shy about a Bloody Mary and a beer chaser after a full day of fishing on the lake. But there was a pronounced difference between these men and their southern counterparts. When we sat down at the lodge bar with its wood paneling, beer signs, and taxidermic pipe, the atmosphere was calm, the company convivial. We got to experience quote unquote Minnesota nice at close range. There was no talk of you not being from around here, no guarded inquiry to the school of politics you followed. These men only wanted to know how the fishing was, how the weather had treated you. It made me wistful for those old hunting trips. I hope they aren't completely gone, but I fear that that brand of outdoorsman is fast going out of style. He doesn't fit in too well with the sloganizing and self-declared Southern rebels of today with their heritage not hate flags and their Molin Labe stickers. Large groups of young and middle-aged white men convinced they are under assault by a culture shift they want to stop, though it continues to outpace them year after year. I don't believe these men are exclusive to the South by any means, but you can see most clearly the things that are part of the place where you grew up. There's a keenness to where you come from, a piercing sensitivity, and it's hard to look away when you've glimpsed an ugly truth. In his seminal ecological essay, A Native Hill, Wendell Berry discusses how the way we regard the land affects our patterns of behavior. In one passage, he talks about the psychological difference between taking a trail, which accommodates itself to the landscape, versus following a road, which cuts through the topography with the aim of maximum efficiency. At the extreme edge of this disregard for place, Berry places the highway, a piece of infrastructure designed as an epitome of all things contrary to the natural order of things. Haste is the word he uses. It's a good word. I believe haste is at the heart of the problem of the modern Southern outdoorsman. Haste to kill, haste to defy, haste to prove manhood. He has forgotten, or more likely forsaken, the patient way of being in the woods. Instead, he collects bones, he accrues points, realizing in real life marksmanship skills he first perfected through years of first-person shooter video games. He goes to gun shows to buy camouflage face paint and pick up the newest tactical flashlights while browsing the latest prepper fiction. He imagines himself as a hero, his conceal and carry permit proving its ultimate worth when he puts down a mass shooter at his job or campus or church. Surely there's another way to be in the woods. I remember walking with my grandfather in the woods, carrying my single barrel 410. It was a warm autumn afternoon, and we were after squirrels. The leaves crinkled like paper underfoot. The sun was clean and strong against the thin sky. This way, he told me. Now it's time to head on to the deep woods. I followed him, thrilled at whatever mystery such a place might hold. I'd like to go out like that again sometime. There are many of us, I imagine, that feel the same way.
Charles, that's just as you noted, that is sadly apropos and is almost an evergreen essay in our current culture. Could I ask a question or sort of make a comment here?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, so I'm just, obviously, as you noted at first, this is yet another sad day in a series of sad days in America and in the world. And you actually even mentioned, this fantasy of taking down the mass shooter. There's a prescience to the essay, but there's like this prescience to all your work. For those who haven't read it, Charles' previous novel deals with white supremacy moving into a small town in East Tennessee, and this novel came out a few years ago. Will you say a word about, you seem to have your finger on a really disturbing aspect of, I'll say, Southern rural culture, but it extends beyond that. Will you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to be prescient when you're surrounded by so many obvious signs along the way. I'm afraid, in a similar way that you've done with Lioness. Um, I think one thing there, I think there are a lot of writers in the Southeast, in Appalachia, whatever regional distinction you want to find, that are interested in asking these big questions and arriving at the difficult and not necessarily clean cut answers. But they're not necessarily our most popular writers because you have to ask yourself, why are people reading? I think that sometimes when you write about issues that are disturbing, you might you have to cultivate a very specific kind of reader. As far as paying attention to it, though, I mean, I think it's almost blindingly obvious the problems that we face. You know, is whether it be, you're kind of leading into the question I had prepared for you to an extent, because I think you're seeing some of the same things, but certainly this relationship between environment, looking at the natural world, and also how we live ethically, and answering that question of how to live. How do we separate the conservational principle from being a responsible citizen? And I don't really see how you can. I find them ultimately very unified in that way, that Barry makes such a central part of his own ethos. And wherein you're mentioning the book that Mark is mentioning is How Fire Runs. It came out in 2020. And actually, Stephanie was talked to me when I did the interview. We did my last virtual talk here at Malaprops, but looking at that, I had an epigram from Barry wherein he links the responsibility of environment to the environment to you know, social justice and social responsibilities. And for him, I think it's kind of like, one thing about Barry that's so alluring or attractive, it's like reading Noam Chomsky. It's like he doesn't try to qualify any of his, what some people would charge as being extreme positions. He's like, well, of course that's what it is. You know, of course empires exploit. Of course they do these things. Your naivete is what prevents you from seeing this in a real light. So I think maybe that would be my answer too, is the willingness to sacrifice all of those social and cultural assumptions that we make, that kind of make life more polite and civil, and to just see things in a clear light. I think it turns up, you know, you turn over the rocks when you look for what's in the river, and you know, you find out unpleasantly at times what it is. So.
And I'll note too, you said, you know, a number of writers looking for these answers, that in that essay and in all your work, and I've read everything you published, you don't arrive at answers. I think it's that, you know, Chekhovian dictum that the job of the writer isn't to solve the problem, but to state the problem clearly. And you're certainly doing it there.
Yeah, I definitely think that there is a pressure to impose a teleology on these things, particularly in fiction, I think, but in the essay as well. And of course, the beauty of the essay form is that it can meander and be elliptical, because that's the nature of how we experience these issues, if we're being honest with ourselves and with the subject matter too.
And you said a word about what kind of readers want to read this given the state of the world. I've always thought, you know, like the job of serious fiction, the stuff I want to read isn't escapism. It just thrusts me deeper into the world. But then you look at the world right now. And you know,
but it's like you've always said, it's that bearing witness, that the principle of bearing witness is so important. And I do. And somebody just recently had made a statement. It wasn't even really in a literary context, but it was about this idea of reading generally. And I think there is this idea among the general public that reading is escapism, that it is distraction. I have never seen it as escapism. It's been very much the opposite for me. It has driven me, like you say, deeper into my engagement with the world. And, you know, I mean, we share a common friend, Eric Reese, who he said recently when we were all together, how like that's how he makes sense of his life, is by reading. Like, how could you possibly move through the world without books. And I mean, that's certainly a sentiment I think that we all share as well.
Yeah, I mean, two writers I love, Don DeLillo and Joan Didion, both famously said, writing and reading, I think, too, is just a concentrated form of thought. And I don't know what I think until I write about it.
Yeah, and the writing too, even more specifically, it's a refinement. It's you know as well as I do that as you step through a text, as you're trying to compose, at the end of each sentence, it opens up a new line of questions that need to be resolved. And then the way of moving is always just trying to engage those questions in the most cogent and interesting ways that you can, so hopefully see it from a different perspective than when you came into the piece originally. What you intended to write and what you end up with, of course, are two totally different things. But that process, I think, and I'm sure we have in the audience too, we may have some writers who would like to speak to that later. But for me, that's always a question of I think that's the great reward is the way in which it really holds my feet to the fire in terms of being precise about how I feel. With that being said, let me flip it over to you. Why don't you read a bit from this excellent book, Lioness?
I was trying to run the clock out, but sure, I appreciate it.
And then I've got a couple for you as well.
Absolutely. So I'll read a little bit from kind of late in this book, Lioness, this novel, and just to tell you a little bit about it. It's set more or less where I am in Western North Carolina up into Virginia, East Tennessee. It's told from the point of view of a husband whose wife has disappeared and probably been killed in an act of ecoterrorism. And the book is his attempt to sort of reconstruct not only what happened on the night that this bomb went off, but how she could have drifted into this. And really sort of the question I'm trying to explore, and I think the question I'm trying to explore in all my work, is sort of what pushes people to extreme acts. And maybe that's something we can talk about a little more. It's the I is the husband, the narrator, and Mara is the wife, and Daniel is the son. So let me read you just a little bit. And I should say that she is an installation artist. In February, Mara and Daniel flew to Miami for a gallery show. The city had been just as she remembered it. The Brickell banks and high tide washing through the storm drains, the water sheeting off a balcony during a sudden rain. She'd watched the chosen sit in coffee shops drinking their $5 flat whites, the mojitos at sidewalk cafes, the Bugattis double parked on Lincoln Drive. She and Daniel had driven to the gallery where she had sat outside and not cried, sat outside and felt nothing, actually, except perhaps a vague disgust, this sense of near exhaustion that never quite bothered to articulate itself. "Mom," Daniel said, "what's wrong?" It was almost, but not quite raining. She looked out the window, bleared and streaked, and then down at her iPod plugged into the radio. She'd been stuck on the same Patsy Cline song for weeks. Not the one you're thinking of. "Mom," he asked. "I'm fine, honey," she said. "Really?" And she was, wasn't she? Because what she felt, wasn't it simply life in the Anthropocene and the sixth extinction, the self-care while the dioxins flow into the groundwater, the meditation apps while the atmosphere ignites and the elephants die, and we are all delivered to the grave via Amazon Prime? "Let's go inside," she said. The show was a success, and after they drove to Marathon Key, where she had rented a small bungalow that sat beneath 2 loquat trees on the edge of the Gulf, she and Daniel would spend a week there, volunteering at a bird sanctuary, driving down to Key West to snorkel and have dinner. I thought it was a good idea, not only for the two of them to go, but for them to go without me. Mara needed some time with Daniel as much as she needed to decompress. At the time, I couldn't say exactly what was going on with her, but later, when she called from the gate at the Miami airport to tell me about her nightmare, she would admit that she'd been thinking too much about the mountain lion she still believed was circling our house. There had been some premonitions, some bad moments when she thought, what? I asked her that day when she called from the airport. And here I imagine her standing, touching Daniel's head as he sits by the broad glass watching the planes taxi. I imagine her walking a few steps away, just beyond earshot, dismissing what would prove to be an intuition as accurate as it was unthinkable. About Daniel, she said, like it's stalking him. A mountain lion? I asked. Like it was going to take him from us, she said. Like a mountain lion was going to take him. You mean physically? I don't know, David, she said. I just know I had this feeling last night, like it was out there, so I set up reading about them online, sort of just waiting. I know it sounds crazy. She told me a little more when they were back home. Told me about the boat, the cage, showed me her feet, but mostly I'm trying to conjure the night. How she reads about panthers on the bungalow porch after Daniel is asleep, alone with her laptop and a can of beer, a citronella candle. How she walks inside to check on him where he sleeps beneath the sheet, the ceiling fan spinning just enough to allow the stolen air to circulate. I imagine her approaching him slowly, creeping closer, letting her hand drift toward his hair that appears damp. But she doesn't touch, won't touch, only lets her hand hang there near him. She has him. He is safe. When she walks back onto the porch, she feels at peace. She breathes deep and smells the loquats that have fallen from the limbs into the yard and shell driveway. The fruit is overripe and bursting, mauled open and showing a single black spot, out of which occasionally will rise a yellow jacket. All week she and Daniel have been collecting them, eating them, but more than that, Mara has been paying attention to them. The stem, if that's what you call it, the stem is thick and often comes off with the fruit, peeling the tree branch so that the waxy green of the wood is visible. It gives her pause. Seeing that raw green makes her question the damage done. It appears so vulnerable, like skin beneath a torn nail, and she has to be careful to twist the fruit, to let her thumbnails sink into the stem and cut it cleanly. She walks barefoot into the dark yard and feels one break wetly beneath the arch of her foot. The smell, sweet, the juice, warm. She slides her foot backward so that the crushed fruit streaks the pad of her foot and comes to rest between her toes. And that is when she sees the cage. I know it sounds crazy. In the craziness of what she has seen, as she is began to imagine that there's this mountain lion that has been circling their house and has been sort of following her, and there are these large cages that are set out to trap it. And the novel sort of moves forward into a near future in which the Everglades have flooded to the point where the National Wildlife Service or some Florida Wildlife are removing mountain lion or removing panthers, Florida panthers, from the Everglades. So it's this crazy kind of jumble of things happening. And that is why I always envy essayists and short story writers when we're giving a reading.
Well, crazy, but also very, very credible at the same time, given the direction of what's going on. I do have a couple of questions, if we can dig into it. I was reading, there's a passage on page 69. I don't know if you've got the book there or you're just reading from a sheet of paper, but
that was from memory.
What's that?
That was from memory.
Oh, well, of course. You're like a poet who simply says the poem. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but there's in italics on page 69, you go into this, there's like, we have screamed for a solid year, and who has listened? What has it accomplished? Almost nothing. They are still bombing children in Afghanistan, and soon enough they'll be bombing them in Iraq. This is obviously takes place in 2003. They are still leveling mountains not 100 miles from here. They're still poisoning our water, our soil. And it's that moment where you unite the global with the local, but you're with that mention of mountaintop removal right there, you seem to be drawing this concern with how the devastation of landscape is related to perhaps colonial expansion, late capitalism, whatever kind of ism you'd like to append to it. But can you talk to that a bit, like what your feelings are as far as this, your conservation or eco-critical ethic as it relates to your worldview? Are they related to one another, or how would you articulate that?
Yeah, well, and not to go back to Wendell Berry, but isn't there a Wendell Berry quote about something
Yeah,
like the same mindset that will clear cut a mountain or something is the same? That's in your book, right?
yeah, that's
Remind me
that
of that quote.
epigram that I had.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. Will you read it?
Well, I don't have it. Mine?
Oh, you don't
No,
have it right there with you.
no, I
Oh,
don't
okay.
have it right here.
All right. Sorry.
Yeah, but so what do you think, though?
Yeah. I mean, it's
I'm
it's
interested because you internationalize so much of your work, and I don't know if you could speak to that quality, finding these, maybe being so globally conscious as your work is. Do you think, how does that set you apart from maybe other writers who write about mountaintop removal? Is there a difference there,
I
or?
mean, I don't know if there's like necessarily a difference, but I can, as for my mindset and my worldview, it's taken me a long time to sort of realize this, foolishly or naively, right? It's all of a piece. Rapacious capitalism, late capitalism. The Barry quote is exactly right. The same people that will clear cut a forest or, you know, level a mountaintop are the same people that are going to drive tanks into eastern Ukraine for natural gas fields,
Yeah.
or are going to build walls on borders or cages for children. I'm not sure I can articulate it well. That's probably why we're novelists. We have to sort of explain this thing in detail. I was writing, so that moment, as you noted, it takes place in 2003, and we're on the cusp. I don't know how many people watching remember that period. I know you do, and I remember it incredibly well. But I remember after 9/11 and things that started in Afghanistan, I remember one day my wife's like, we're going to go to war in Iraq next. And this was sometime in 2002. And I'm like, that's absurd. Iraq has nothing to do with any of this. And of course, like, that was exactly right. It's just all of a piece. And I felt like at that point, or maybe a few years later, in environmental causes and in these wars, I felt like I just screamed my head off to no end. You mentioned our friend Eric Reese, and I know he sometimes talks about talking to his environmental writing students at the University of Kentucky and saying, like, I hope you have the energy to pick up this fight because I don't have this energy anymore. And I think part of that exhaustion just comes from seeing the interconnectivity of it all.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's also interesting to me. I was kind of thinking about this as you were talking, how there's so much that's going on and how much gets lost in the information shuffle.
Mm-hmm.
I saw something on Twitter the other day, which is, if you want to see a case study and how information is, metastasizes in minutes. There was a very earnest person posting on and on about how that after the invasion of Iraq, that the American government turned around and was months later would then invade Afghanistan. And I said, wait a minute, I remember this, what happened. We were in Afghanistan. And
right.
It's incredible how so many people, they develop ideas, I think, too, about what's going on in the world, but the facts are shuffled out of place. And there's a danger in that as well. I don't have anything real beneficial to say about that, but it was just kind of a wake-up call. Is maybe the advantage of lived experience. Like, wait, I was there. I remember how that happened.
Right, yeah.
So a lot of these very earnest younger thinkers are sometimes really off base a lot of the time. But go ahead.
And it's interesting, right, that that you're pulling that the platform that's coming out of is Twitter, right, where supposedly so much of our intelligent debate and discussion happens, which is ridiculous, right?
Putatively,
sure. But I mean, like, books are, I think, serious essay, serious nonfiction, serious fiction. It might be the last place left where these serious, sustained discussions and thought experiments takes place.
Yeah, no, I think so.
I mean, this might be it, right? I mean, if people, and maybe the decline in serious reading probably somehow tracks on some sort of curve with the rise of misinformation. And I don't know where that goes to, but I think this is all of some larger piece. I hope somebody in the audience is writing a novel that links all of this at this moment. but it's just
Yeah.
disheartening because it's hard to see. I don't know. I don't see a correction coming in that sense.
Um, no, I don't really either, but who knows? Hopefully we're
Yeah.
wrong. I do have another specific
Sure.
question about the
Sure.
novel.
Yeah.
And that's the figure of Chris Bright, who is so central, kind of a plot mechanism as much as a character, I guess
Mhm.
you would say. Did you have how did you develop that character? Is there a specific person that maybe you had in mind when you created him? Maybe just speak to the audience a little bit about Chris Bright and how he works
Sure.
as a pillar of the book.
Right. Yeah. So Chris Bright is the character that Mara, the wife, has engaged in this act of ecoterrorism. And what the narrator learns is that Chris Bright has this long history of activism that has essentially been hidden. He simply hadn't been aware of it. Yeah, I had two things in mind. I mean, because we are writers and thus we're narcissists, a lot of them is me. I mean, his childhood is this kind of bucolic childhood where you're incredibly idealistic and you're incredibly naive, I think. And the problem with having an overload of idealism when you're young is that it gets smashed by the world pretty quickly, and that can turn to a pretty heavy cynicism. So part of that was me, and another part is I made a very dear friend I met when I was in divinity school, actually 15, 16 years ago or something. And he's a long time activist who has just, um, I mean, he's just consistently engaged with every issue and he's given his life toward it. So I was trying to find the balance between someone who grew up with that sort of idealism and what happens to that kind of idealism and how malleable you can be when it kind of gets smashed, and then trying to transfer it into this character. So it's sort of a composite, this character who actually is engaged in these things.
Okay.
I'm not sure if
Yeah,
that's a
I was
useful
interested.
response.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you didn't have any historical figures in mind, or like people maybe?
Well, I certainly had in mind, you and I have discussed the wonderful film If a Tree Falls that looks at the kind of the birth of the Earth Liberation Front, Earth First, so forth.
Sure.
And and I had in mind vaguely, I don't. I mean, I feel like it's a leading question. You're leading the witness. Did you have someone in mind?
I mean, no, not necessarily. I was just curious, really.
Yeah.
I know
I mean,
that
I think.
sometimes when I'll create a figure that's such a like a charismatic
Mhm.
and has that I often am thinking of somebody. So I was just
Yeah.
curious if that was
I mean, I
something that
guess
you
I was
did.
thinking mainly of my friend who
Yeah.
is an activist and is still, though he's older now, he's still going strong. And I just remember him regaling me with these stories that would be absolutely unbelievable were they not true.
Yeah.
Um, and it was sort of that kind of
Sure.
courage and steadfastness in the face of the world, and just the thing of you were going against not even 99% of the world. You were going against almost everything, right?
Yeah.
You are defying the logic of the day. You're defying capitalism. You're defying everything. So
Yeah. And I guess the last, just because we got a couple minutes, I guess
mhm.
Patricia might jump in, but this was kind of a more focused version of a kind of question that we usually probably get a lot of it. And that's, but I want to, did you have a specific group of books that you felt you were
Oh
really
yeah.
aware of while you were writing this book, as opposed to not like just what are your influences, but was there anything specifically?
Yeah, no, and I'll answer that, and I'd like to ask you the same thing. I actually physically get the books off my shelf and put them in front of me, like a small stack of 4 or 5 books that I always want to have near me. And that what I really kept close were Joan Didion's last 3 novels, not are nonfiction but are fiction, because it functions with this. I'm always fascinated how she does things narratively. I know you know those novels, but if people in the audience don't know them, they always have a first-person narrator who is sort of maybe 1 or 2 steps removed from the story, who's telling it from a privileged position, but they're removed. So I was thinking very much of Didion, and I also had on my desk one of my favorite writers is Robert Stone, who I think is one of our finest, or was one of our finest writers when it comes to taking a plot that's kind of fast moving and has a lot of action, but also has philosophical depth. So those Didion and Stone were writers that I was periodically sort of opening up and dipping back into. What about you? I mean, I know this is a collection, so it's a little different, but
Yeah, no, but I think maybe even more so because it is a switch from fiction to nonfiction. I mean, honestly, as far as writing about heavy family issues and nature writing, Helen McDonald's H is for Hawk was certainly a big book for me to read while I was working on this, and that felt very necessary at times, to particularly some of the more personally difficult essays, I suppose. She handles that so well. So that would be a big recommendation I would make to anybody who might be tuning in, is H is for Hawk. And I have her collection of essays, Vesper Flights, which I've begun to read, and it's excellent as well, but I have not completed it.
And H is for Hawk, if I may say, is a book about grief as well.
It is, yeah, it is. It's very much a grief memoir to an extent, but it's also a bibliographic memoir, which is so interesting because she talks about White's The Goshawk at length in that book. So it's really kind of an amazing piece of writing, I think, that she pulls off. But her, I mean, I mentioned Sigurd Olson's The Singing Wilderness in that essay. He certainly is a good nature writer. But a really kind of a great book that opened the essay form up to me in a different way is one that you recommended, which was Sarah Bakewell's book on Montaigne, How to Live.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, if anything will ignite an interest in classical essayists, that's that book.
Absolutely.
Should we,
Tricia, are there questions?
Yeah.
Why, yes. Thank you so much for inviting me in. And I would like to ask a couple of questions. First of all, as I was listening to the two of you speak, I was thinking of Joyce Carol Oates and her 1966 essay, Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? That short story.
Yeah.
Because both of you really are willing to go to the darkness, and yet don't answer all the questions, right? I mean, sometimes, especially when you're dealing with the darkness of a human heart or actions or things that you may not be able to resolve. And so I just wanted to say that short story, Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? Came to my mind. And I wonder, and of course, Joan Didion as well. But I wonder, when you're trying to craft a character and you're dealing with darkness with characters, how do you get yourself in the mindset to do that? And what have you ever edited yourself where you felt like you went too far?
Do you want to start with that, Charles, or I can if you prefer?
I can answer that. I mean, I think the nature, certainly it's different with fiction, and it seems like your question is directed more to fiction writing. I mean, the one thing about a fiction writer is you are employing the imagination. Everything you create is an act of imagination. So you have to basically be willing to create the character as fully as possible, and be willing to think as that character would think, and create something that's authentic. I don't think there is going too far exactly. I mean, certainly sometimes an editor or an audience member will say, well, that's too dark. I personally don't see that as a problem in writing. I think that, of course, I had a reviewer one time say that my stories were darker than Cormac McCarthy. So I'm probably not the best person to ask for a limitation there. But I don't really censor myself as far as that, as long as it's serving some ultimate end within the plot or within the story. If it's gratuitous, then that's different. To write to merely to shock is not something I would be interested in.
I was thinking of also two works of memoir, Mary Carr's The Liars Club, which, when I first read that, I thought, wow, can you put that in a book? Like, I was kind of cringing a few times.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Catherine Harrison's The Kiss,
Sure.
Yeah.
which was whoa, I didn't know
Yeah.
we were going to go there either. So there have been a few memoirs, nonfiction, where I thought, oh,
Sure, but I mean, if you look at really kind of the modern foundation, if you go back to Rousseau's Confessions, I mean, they go there. You know, he kind of sets the bar from the beginning to go into these places. I mean, that's what makes memoir such a fascinating form to me.
Mark,
Yeah,
what
for
about you?
yeah. So for me, when I first started as a writer, I think for my first probably three books, all I wanted to do was go to the dark places because I felt like it felt provocative to me and it felt like something that should be done. And I don't regret that. But I realized somewhere along the way that there was a falseness to it. That right, life is full of darkness and sadness and terrible things, but it's also full of laughter and joy. And to exclude that happier side of life is as false as right to exclude the darker side, which I've been so concerned with. So my books, I think, are like Charles. My stuff's pretty dark too, but I hope there is like a glimmer of something in there that is redeeming, some little bit of hope or light or insight or something. I have never, like Charles, I've never censored myself and said, "Well, that's too far." Probably, maybe I should have though. I mean, I certainly had some awkward conversations with family members who have read things and been like, really, Mark. So,
And then you said, yes, really.
well,
Yeah.
and then you're kind of like, yes, really, but oh, yeah, I mean, because you can't take it back.
Right. I mean, that's kind of what it seemed to be when the two of you were talking about Twitter, and that seems to be a place where people can a lot of times either say anonymous things or not be held accountable for the things they say, and they may go there sort of, but when you publish something and then you have readers and then you have critics and then it's made into a movie, or whatever, then there's these layers of people asking questions about, wow, what was that all about? But I really enjoy that discourse and that journey. We have a question for Charles about the essay experience. Over how long a period of time did you write these essays? And how distant were you from the losses that you write about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's about three essays in here that were written. The oldest was about 10 years old, and that's the first one that appears in the collection. It's one called Groupings, and there are two or three others that show up. But most of the essays were written over the first year of COVID. And I'd say like probably 85% of the book was written over that first year of COVID. And I had already kind of sold the idea of the book, and so sat down and wrote it at that time. So as far as the major loss of the most major loss of the book is the suicide of my son in 2015. So that would have been 4 or 5 years later when that was being written. So that's one of the things that kind of comes up is it's not, I don't believe that you can write two immediately when you're dealing with grief in that way, because when you write a memoir or even an essay, you need to have room for the kind of literary exploration and distance to make it something that is meant to be consumed by readership. So there was that. One of the kind of the ways that the book is set up is and it's the last thing that was written, which is there's a very brief preface that kind of spills the beans on everything that's going to come. So as the idea was to kind of cast a shadow for the reader and let them know what they were in for, and let that permeate of your reading of things that were maybe written from a different point of time where certain things hadn't occurred yet. So there was a kind of a literary device as well. And again, that's the sort of thing that you sit down and write and think about once you have time to think about how the memoir would work as a single book rather than how it is recollections from my own life. So for me, distance was a significant enabling factor in writing the book.
I had a question about eco activists versus eco terrorists. And when you were talking, Mark, I immediately had to Google the documentary I had seen, If a Tree Falls, about the Earth Liberation Front. And then
Right.
you mentioned that. And I wonder what it's like to kind of look. You said were having conversations with someone who said you would believe these stories. What one of the things about that documentary that really raised questions for me was, how do you know who's telling the truth? And when do you know if you're really dealing with an informant or somebody I mean, is there any purity? I guess, is there a pure cause? So how do you address that when you're in your book, or when you're creating a character who has let's call it a righteous cause?
Oh gosh, I don't know. That's a great question. I mean, for all we know, Charles is an informant right now, relaying this back to the feds. Yeah, spoiler. So maybe, I mentioned Charles had asked if this was based on someone, and I mentioned this friend I have. I've known a lot of activists and several people that have done pretty radical things, and this is probably the single person I know that I would trust what this person says unflinchingly, and is pure of heart, with no, as far as I can tell or discern, no ulterior methods. And that is just a pure gut feeling of knowing someone. I have no criteria to discern this. And as far as like the eco-terrorist versus the active eco-terrorism versus the active eco-justice, that's just that, I think, that old saw that one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist, right? It just depends on what side of the line you're standing on. But I think that's what long form nonfiction and fiction does so well. This is nuanced, and there's no clear cut answer, I think. And you need the space of a book to sort of articulate these things and try to dig into them, at least if you want to arrive at some proper framework of how to think about it. That doesn't answer your question at all, but yeah, that's the best I got.
It's just a kind of a thought thing. I was thinking of the Weather Underground, and that documentary about the Weather Underground and how they factionalized and turned on each other.
Yeah.
Those are interesting, provocative questions. Another question about process. Then is it different, Charles, writing a series of essays versus writing, a novel? And would you do it again?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I'd say writing nonfiction is a lot more pleasurable in terms of it's the purest practice of writing that we have. And I would absolutely do it again. I probably am really kind of captivated by the idea of doing it with something where the subject matter would be a little bit more enjoyable to work with. As Mark knows, I'm engaged in this quixotic undertaking wherein I've gone from I used to run when I was a very young man, but in the last, 8 months, I've started trail running and ultra marathons. Mark has run his own, but I'm trying to run 100-mile ultra marathon this fall. So kind of I'm have in the back of my mind the idea of a nature / George Plimpton-esque kind of participatory journalism in this absurd adventure that I've put myself on. So that would be a lot of fun. And to write, to still be able to write about nature and friendship and all those things, but with a little bit more levity and just a kind of a self-mocking tone would be a lot of fun, I think.
Charles, are you looking at my bookshelf for some reason? Because I want to show you what I have right here.
Charles is not only a great runner, his eyesight is incredible.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Really kind of disturbing.
I can actually see around corners even.
I don't think that camera was pointed there.
I told you he was an informant, Patricia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the truth. The truth is out. So, Mark, what about you? A little bit about process. Are you going to break form, or are you going to stick with the form? And what do you
No,
like or don't
I
like?
think regrettably, for better or worse, I'm a novelist. I don't think I occasionally write an essay, but it's very rare. And for me, the process is there's usually like a constellation of things I'm interested in, and I'll usually write about those in fiction. I got really interested when we moved to Boone like 6 or 7 years ago in how adamantly people hold on to the notion of mountain lions still being here, which is they're they're not. I mean, occasionally one might migrate through that's lost, but that's it. But it's sort of this notion of like wanting to cling to the idea of wildness and it's still being around us. So I just get interested in different things and I start writing about them and I'm not sure how they connect. So some parts of this novel I wrote, you know, 4 or 5, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I think, and they just sat for a long time as I thought about them. So mine is this process of like slowly bringing these little points of light until eventually there's something resembling a constellation that you can make some kind of sense out of. Yeah, so it's very nebulous, I guess.
Oh no, that seemed very clear to me. I think that you've got your process. Now, do you think that as we're wrapping up here, do you think there's something to the description of your works as dealing with issues of masculinity? Do you mean to do that, or is that is that blurbiness?
Charles, you've got the blurb. You have the blurb that talks that. I'll just say really
Right. Yeah.
briefly.
I mean, I don't know how to answer that question in some ways. With memoir, you just write from your own experience, and you might have commentary on what that might mean. I find that to be a question kind of like, what is it like to be an Appalachian? Like there are so many different Appalachians. There are so many different masculinities, and what that might mean, and how that would be something that changes not only across individuals, but even through the course of a life, and what that might mean as well. So, I think that it certainly is part of what I write about, but I don't self-consciously sit down and write, I'm going to be an essayist of masculinity.
Yeah.
Because I would
And
never presume something so grand.
I feel Charles, I echo Charles. I mean, obviously I see the world through the lens of of being a guy, but I never sit down and think like, what does this mean for me, particularly as a guy? I am just trying to, that thing we talked about earlier, I'm trying to explain the world to myself as best I can. I'm trying to make sense of things and navigate. And maybe I think sometimes, Patricia, this has a lot to do with biography. Charles was a Marine. I went to a military college in the South. We both spend a lot of time outdoors. So I think it's sometimes it's just an easy label to attach to someone, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm definitely looking for the books that are going to deal with the war in Iraq. I know that they're coming, some are already out, but for me, it was a very formative war, probably the most formative war of my adult life. And I really am fascinated by us grappling with it culturally and in our creative processes. So the fact that the two of you kind of talked about that, I'm really looking forward to it. What's next for the two of you? Is that okay to ask, or you like?
Yeah.
No?
It is with me. I mean,
Yeah, no, go ahead, Charles.
well, I mean, unfortunately, it's what's in the news right now. I'm writing a novel about gun violence and right-wing manipulation of the media, or right-wing conspiracy media specifically, like
that book
podcasts and
about
stuff like
Sandy
that.
Hook. That book about Sandy Hook that came out just pretty recently in the last few months by a journalist.
Yeah.
I would look forward to reading that. I'm really fascinated by that, Charles. And what about you, Mark?
Yeah, I may be finished with the novel. I hope that I'm finished with it. I taught for 3 years in a prison in Florida, and I was really close to three of the men who got out, and their lives took some very divergent paths. One of them really tragically, who took his own life. So I've often wondered, like, what happened. I know the facts of what happened after they were released from prison, but I've often wondered, like, psychologically, how did this play out? So it's sort of my attempt to think my way into their post incarceration life. So
Well,
cheery stuff all around from both of us, Patricia.
Well, you know what? I'm heartened by it, because I think tackling these stories and trying to find a way to metabolize it as a creative person and then reflecting that to the reader, I think that's one of the most important things you could do for society, is to go through that. And I applaud it. And I know your readers and your students and your fans are so glad that you take these topics on for whatever reasons, maybe not really clear to yourselves sometimes, but I think that they're well worth doing. And I appreciate the two of you for being wonderful conversationalists with each other. You really didn't need me, because you asked each other such great questions. And that's a testimony to the careful reads that you did of each other's work. And I want to thank you both so much. Mark Powell for being here this evening and reading from Lioness, and Charles Dodd White for being here this evening and reading from A Year Without Months. Thank you both so much for your time, and we look forward to what you're doing next with great anticipation. And thank you, audience, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you,
Patricia. Thank you,
Thank
Stephanie,
you,
as
everyone.
well.